introduced, my name is Jiun Yun. I'm a master student here in GSIS. And thank you for Assistant Secretary General for your overview of the Common Agenda. And out of the many aspects of the Common Agenda, we would like to focus on governance and politics and youth as well. So when you think about a young person around you, what do you think is their biggest concern? We thought their youth's biggest concern are directly related to the future, such as being qualified for a job, having a secure housing, and also having enough savings for their emergencies. However, recent events worsened the youth's concerns. When we were faced with unexpected events, we experienced absence of social safety net that were supposed to protect us from the consequences. For example, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, weakness of our social structure in health, education, employment, and environment revealed bare truths. Not only that, we witnessed inequality between developing countries, but also among rich and poor people within a country. So, we wonder how we can mitigate the effects of unexpected events. We think the answer is better protection for everyone, not just in a national level, but also in a global level. And we agree with the Common Agenda saying that it is time to embrace global solidarity. Youth have to understand that our world is interconnected and the events from the other side of the world can impact them. So, for example, when a financial crisis hits the other part of the world, it can impact our chances of being employed. And we're also currently experiencing that with the war in Ukraine because it is impacting every part of the world economically, financially, and socially. So, and we agree with, we can say that every challenge in the realm of development can affect youth to some extent. And we think the role of the global agenda is to promote global solidarity and international development so it can secure the protection that we need. But unfortunately, we think youth do not really relate themselves to the global agenda. We thought of the several reasons why youth think of that way. And the first thing is because youth are more interested in issues that is directly related to their immediate concerns rather than global issue. And the second reason is that youth tend to think that development is area only for experts, governments, and institutions, so there's no room for youth for their involvement. And the final reason is, as mentioned in the report regarding the Common Agenda, youth lacks of trust in existing institutions and leadership in addressing their needs. To address these issues, we have two suggestions. And the first suggestion is having a channel of communication between youth and the UN. Common Agenda mentioned establishing a UN Youth Council, and we think this can be a great channel of communication and youth and contribution that UN currently lacks. However, we have two concerns regarding the UN Council, and this is how will this council be integrated to the UN system? And the second concern is how seriously will youth's voice contributed to the UN's discussion. And the second suggestion is regaining trust between UN and the youth. We think if youth have a greater awareness of UN's action on the ground and its progress in sustainable development, it can help them understand UN's action more and its practicality in promoting global solidarity, thus lead to a higher engagement of youth and understanding in UN's action. We think there are many ways to promote this regaining trust, and we think this event like this discussion where we can share our thoughts and concerns regarding global agenda and issue is a very great start. This is end of my presentation as a student group, and me and my fellows, Nico and Lua, would like to thank everyone who gave us a chance to speak at this discussion. Thank you.
Good afternoon, I'm Sijang Lim. I am an associate professor here at the College of International Studies and Graduate School of International Studies. I'm also grateful for this opportunity to be part of this wonderful joint discussion. So my comments today, or maybe I should say my rough ideas that I want to share today, center around two broad challenges that I think the United Nations or the global governance in general might face in this time of crisis, as Mr. Xu already mentioned. The first challenge I can think of as a political scientist is actually building nicely onto our student presentation. It was about the role of the UN as a credible and trustworthy messenger, because as we know, messenger matters as much as the message. We know that UN here is playing a very, very important role as the primary messenger of this new Our Common Agenda. And as Mr. Xu already told you, the UN has put forward key proposals across the 12 key commitments. But we should ask, how might people, global citizens across the globe, would view these proposals? Who are actually the we that perceive these commitments as our common mandates? So here we think that the role of the UN as the messengers matters, because the persuasive power of the message really depends on how the messenger is being trusted or not trusted. So here, it's actually part of my research. I'm interested in public attitudes towards various intergovernmental organizations. Here you are seeing a plot where I am visualizing the level of trust in the United Nations across the peoples across the globe. And the graph is basically showing responses of people to the question about how much confidence they have, individual citizens in different countries, on United Nations, from a great deal of confidence to none at all. And you can see here that those who are showing the greatest confidence in UN and its work is citizens of Norway, Israel, Finland, Denmark, Sweden. But if you go to the other end, there are citizens from Egypt, Jordan, Libya, and Tunisia who are showing almost no trust in UN at all, which means our common agenda is unlikely to strongly resonate with those citizens who are living in areas where it's most likely to make positive difference. And this leads to my first comment on the potential opportunity of the UN in this time of crisis, which centers on proactive public diplomacy, reaching out to areas and peoples who are particularly exhibiting lower level of trust in EU. And this, I think, is nicely being consistent with the messages in our common agenda, which is putting people at the center. The second challenge, I think, pertains more to Mr. Xu's comment on the role, on the impact of pandemic, as well as the war in Ukraine, and the associated perils of outgroup rejection. As a political scientist, I read a lot of studies talking about how external threats, be it pandemic, be it war, can foster in-group solidarity and the rally round the flag effect. Of course, the increased solidarity is not necessarily bad, but it can be bad when it breeds exclusionary and dominating attitudes, especially in more advanced democracies that is expected to have greater resilience to these crises. But then also, I think the UN can turn these challenges into opportunities by trying to again engage in public diplomacy, with the central message being inclusive rather than exclusive patriotism. So as I said, it's very good that some of the countries with big resilience, strong resilience, being very proud of their nations. They can admire their internal values, norms, and achievements, as South Koreans were when we were doing very well in the COVID-19 crisis. But then, this doesn't need to breed exclusive and dominating attitudes, because it can be made into more constructive patriotism and also globally sensitive patriotism. I think this is what UN can try to help the global citizens to be to have the inclusive patriotic attitudes rather than the dominating one. So I guess this is the end of my comments, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to share my ideas.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. It's also my pleasure to present a few thoughts here. I find the common agenda very intriguing and very important, and I actually want to share a few thoughts on economic growth as such. Right? You talked a lot about GDP and about decarbonization. I was thinking a bit more about a goal that often does not receive so much attention. Yeah, goal number 12, I think the cubes, it's down there. Also, it stands very much below, so it maybe represents its importance. But I want to show that actually it's very important. Yeah? And I've been teaching myself economic growth, economic development for 10 years now. At the beginning, I didn't care much about the environmental aspect of it, and in conventional models of economic growth, we assume that there are like unlimited resources available. However, of course, in reality, we've realized more and more that ever-growing global economic output requires also ever-increasing amounts of natural inputs, which are limited, obviously, on a limited planet. So, Goal 12.2 is actually concerned with this to achieve by the year 2030 a sustainable management of natural resources. And currently we are totally off track to reach this goal. You can see GDP and population growth in the world are the major drivers, and material footprint, which is the one that should actually be falling, we want to have it fall somehow. We have not gotten there, we are far away from it. Material footprints basically refer to four broad groups. This is biomass, fossil fuels, metal ores, and non-metallic minerals. You can see how they all have gone up substantially over time. If we look at countries and look at countries by development, you can see we have the HDI value of countries here on this axis, and then we have the material footprint per capita on the vertical axis. And we can see that human development is obviously positively related with higher natural resource use, higher material footprints. Now the goal is to bring those countries down here by the year 2030, right? And that's of course currently something that doesn't seem to be easily attainable. So, the question is, how do we get there? How many planets are we currently consuming? Basically the global footprint network, I like this very much. It's very obvious or very intuitive for students. Calculates the ecological footprint relative to the world biocapacity. And then you can see basically how rich countries are currently consuming at a level which would require actually an Earth with just 4 times the size than our Earth, right? And the only countries that are meeting the sustainable use of resources are the ones in low levels of human development, most of them being in sub-Saharan Africa. So the question is, what is the solution? How do we get the levels, the material footprints down? How do we get the natural resource use down? And green growth has been suggested in Rio Plus 20, 2012, basically at the conference, by the UN and major international organizations and the member states as a solution. Green growth and the green economy. And there's a lot of effort has been made to work into that direction. You know that in Korea has the Global Green Growth Institute. And what is green growth actually? And green growth is based on the idea of absolute decoupling, meaning decouple economic activity from environmental impacts and resource use. And this graph illustrates it. So basically we want to have economic activity going up, which of course we need, especially in poor countries. Poor countries have a right to also become materially more affluent and also to have decent work opportunities, of course. At the same time, we want to bring down environmental pressures. We want them to fall. So this is what we call absolute decoupling. And this is what green growth aims to achieve. There's also a concept of relative decoupling, basically, which is economic activity rises, and the resource use and the environmental pressures also rise, but they rise at a smaller, slower pace. Yeah? Now, are we on the way to achieve this absolute decoupling, this green growth? I showed you this graph before. If we were on a way, then the material footprint should be falling, right? And currently we are just a little bit on the way of like relative decoupling, but we are actually far, far away from the absolute decoupling here. So does green growth actually work? Yeah? Lots of research has been done on this question recently, and most studies actually suggest that it might not be feasible. Of course, we have to say those studies are using data from the first and the second decade of the 21st century, where most countries have not yet implemented all these measures and all these technologies, right? But so far, no single country case has been observed in the past of absolute decoupling, of green growth, if you want. The closest we get is with greenhouse gases in high-income countries. As for material footprints, however, studies suggest that we are very far away from green growth or absolute decoupling. Here's just a table from a systematic review of more than 800 studies on decoupling, where I think it was 16 authors from European countries, different European countries, put in a lot of work in reviewing all these studies and looking actually at the elasticities, resource use elasticities of GDP. Yeah, so what happens to the use of resources, the energy use, when the GDP goes up by 1%? Yeah? And in order to achieve absolute decoupling, these numbers should be below zero. You can see that only one number is below zero, and it's this here for greenhouse gases, and it's even not significant. So, especially for material footprints, elasticities are still very high. So, yeah, if we conclude that so far green growth doesn't work, then what is the conclusion? What is the policy implication? Well, if you ask me, if we have limited resources, some countries are already rich, OECD countries, then what is the point of growing these countries even more? Yeah? Should we engage in a discussion talking about whether it's actually ethical for rich countries to grow even further? Isn't it just sufficient to keep our level of per capita incomes in the rich countries because we actually have enough? There's only a question of distribution which we have to address, right, in the rich countries, but not a question of not enough incomes available. In addition to that, we have to improve, of course, efficiency of resources, of resource use, circular economy, sharing economy, and so on. And then become serious at the UN about agreements to lower material footprints. Yeah, so we've been successful in these agreements when it comes to CO2 emission reductions. Yeah, and these national determined contributions and so on. But we are lacking a lot behind to have effective implementation mechanisms for material footprints, for the use of natural resources. Here again, one could actually follow the same logic and, for example, say, okay, let's look at voluntary commitments, NDCs for material footprint reductions, or some kind of cap and trade systems as we know them from the decarbonization approaches. That's it. Thank you very much.
I will focus on the impact of new digital technologies on human rights and SDGs. We have discussed the consequences of COVID-19, and people say that before pandemic is different from the after pandemic. I think that this discussion comes basically because there are fundamental changes because of digital transformation and more use of digital technologies. Consequences of that there's a fundamental changes going on in our society. And digital transformation creates huge opportunities for human society. But at the same time, it poses serious challenges in our society, not only in terms of human rights, but also in terms of our life. And in order to achieve the SDGs, actually we have to consider the consequences of digital transformation. In that vein, I had written a report to the Human Rights Council as a member of advisory committee a few years ago. The report began 2018 and finally submitted to the council in 2021, last year. And there was a resolution in the council based on that report. Then the efforts is continue on. But basically, I was a rapporteur of that report, and the title of the report was Possible Impacts, Challenges, Opportunities of New Emerging Digital Technologies with regard to promotion and protection of human rights. I think that this is a very important one I want to introduce briefly, because I believe to achieve the SDGs successfully, the promotion and protection of human rights are extremely important, and particularly is important in digital age. In the report, the key word of the report is holistic. I emphasized holistic approach. There are three aspects of a holistic approach. The first is in terms of human rights. We talk about the interdependence and indivisibility of the human rights. The human rights cannot be separated, but in reality, it has been discussed separately. And also, human rights mechanisms have been fragmented. But in this digital era, I strongly believe this separation or fragmentation is really problematic. So we need to think about more holistic approach on human rights. And second approach is about new technology. When we talk about many digital technologies, from AI, big data, blockchain, drones, etc. But all those technologies actually it comes down to the data, collection, management, and use of data. So I put the concept of the datafication cycle, which means the collection of data and transfer and decision by the users. The whole cycle, we have to see it holistically so that we can understand both challenges and opportunities of new technologies. I don't want to spend too much time explaining technical issues. But thirdly, which is most important in today's discussion, is about the actors and governance. So we talk about the multi-stakeholderism. UN is ultimately organization of the states. The states are members of the UN. But without the participation of other non-state actors, UN is not properly operating. And the goal of the UN cannot be achieved without the participation of non-state actors. We know that. But it is even more important in digital age. Particularly, from my view, engaging the private sector, the private companies, is extremely important to achieve the goal of human rights and SDGs. So in that regard, what I want to emphasize today is that first, engaging the other actors are important, but also the linkage among the UN agencies are extremely important. Now, I have worked for the human rights mechanisms for the last 8 years. Then I know, for example, SDGs, we talk about human rights-based approach. But I see the lack of linkage between the human rights mechanisms and SDG field. The human rights, UN has established the particular human rights mechanisms which to hold states accountable. We have a treaty body committees, we have a human rights bodies, but it doesn't have a close link to the other UN agencies, in my view. So I think for the future, it is extremely important to link each other while the UN human rights mechanisms continue to make reform efforts for a more holistic approach. Okay, that's all. Thank you very much.